Hello, this is Brian Galloway with the Gloster Street Church of Christ. This is the class for the 1st through 4th or 5th or 6th, whoever wants to watch it, grades. And this class is for June the 21st. If you remember, a couple of weeks ago, we started studying about parables. And we said that a parable was an earthly story, a common story, with a heavenly or a spiritual meaning. Last week we looked at the parable of the sower, or the parable of the soils. A man sowed seed and it fell on 4 different types of ground. Good ground and rocky ground or stony ground, thorny ground, and on the wayside. And depending on the ground that it fell on, depended on what happened to the seed, how it grew. And of course those grounds represented our hearts. Today we're going to study a parable from Matthew chapter 13. And in fact, it came in Matthew just after the parable of the sower who sowed seeds on the 4 different kinds of grounds. This parable is called the parable of the tares, T-A-R-E-S. A tare is a weed. Now your mom and dad or your grandparents may have gardens. And sometimes they may take you out to the gardens and they may see some grass or some weeds and tell you to pull that because they don't want the weeds in their garden. The weeds will take up the nutrients that they want the plants to have. Well, that's what this parable is about. A man sowed a field with wheat seed. Now, once you sowed the field, you couldn't see the seed until it came up. His enemy came along and sowed the field with weeds. So you've got wheat seeds and you've got weeds, both in the same field. And when they start to grow, the servants of this man realize there's wheat growing here and there's weeds growing here too. And they go and they tell the owner of the field, somebody has sowed weeds in your field. Do you want us to pull them all up? And there were so many weeds, he said no. Because if you pull them up, you may pull some of the wheat plants up with them. Let them both grow. And when they mature, we'll know which ones are the weeds and which ones are the wheat. And we'll get rid of the weeds first, and then we'll reap the wheat. And that's what they did. When it was time to reap the wheat, they went through and they got all the weeds out and they piled them in a pile and they burned the weeds. And then they took the wheat and they reaped it. Now, people back in Jesus' day were very familiar with what he was talking about. They knew all about weeds in their wheat. What's Jesus trying to teach them? Well, Jesus explains to us that the sower was actually Christ, and the field was the world, and the seed represented the children of God, the children of the kingdom, Christians, and the weeds represented people who chose not to follow God, chose not to do God's will. And here is the point. You may have weeds, you may have people in this world that are not living the way God wants them to live, and it may seem like nothing happens to them. They're not punished for that. Sometimes when we do something that we shouldn't do, we get punished. But sometimes we don't. And you may see people that go to school with you that don't act the way they should, and nobody ever sees them and they never get punished. And even as an adult, your parents may know people who don't live the life that God wants them to live, and yet nothing seems to happen to them. Well, what Jesus is saying is there's going to come a time that there's going to be a judgment. That's the harvest. And God knows who are doing his will and who are not. God knows who lives the way they should and who doesn't. And God, when that judgment day comes, is going to separate the wheat from the weeds, the wheat from the tares. And the tares will be destroyed and the wheat will be brought into heaven. Point is, we need to live the way God wants us to live. We need to do what God wants us to do and be the people that God wants us to be, because no matter what happens to us on this earth, when the judgment day comes, God will know who have been doing what he wants and who haven't. So remember that tares are weeds. And remember, we have a choice. As we all grow in God's field on this earth, I can choose to obey God, or I can choose not to obey God, but someday I'm going to have to answer for how I live. So I want to choose to obey God so that God will be pleased with me. I hope you're doing your lessons, and I will have these hopefully emailed out to your parents by the time you see this. And they will also get an email with some review questions so that you can remember a little bit about each of these parables. And I watched while Casey and Johnson and Anna Mae made the 12th Pew Packers video last night. I'm making this on Thursday. And it's a good one, so you'll want to make sure you watch that Pew Packers as well. Hope you have a tremendous week, and we will see you next.